Have you ever stopped to think about, how your thoughts are entirely your own, like locked away inside, just in the armchair of your mind? But what if that feeling, like that sense of ownership, was actually an illusion? Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going deep on a philosophical brain teaser, one that you as a philosopher have probably wrestled with. The connection, or maybe the clash, between externalism and self-knowledge.
Absolutely. It's a question that goes right to the heart of how we understand our minds, right? I mean, do our thoughts, like the actual content of them, come purely from within, from our own internal mental states? That's the internalist view. Or, and this is where it gets really interesting, does the outside world, the environment, actually shape and even determine what we think? That's the essence of externalism. And for us philosophers, the next logical step is, well, what does all this mean for self-knowledge? If our thoughts are somehow molded by things outside of us, how can we truly know what we're thinking just by looking inward?
It's like, if my thoughts aren't fully my own, then how can I really claim to know them in that deep personal way? It's a real puzzle, especially when you think about the idea of armchair self-knowledge. This is the classic idea that we can just sit back, introspect, and grasp the content of our thoughts without needing to investigate the world. A philosopher we all know, Descartes, really pushed this view, saying self-knowledge was like unshakable, not influenced by anything external.
Right. And then externalism comes along and throws a wrench in the works. It suggests that the world isn't just something our thoughts are about. It actually goes deeper than that. The environment helps to create the content of our thoughts. That sets up a fascinating conflict, right? If the world is influencing the very essence of what we're thinking, then how can we have this direct, privileged access to our thoughts that Descartes and others talked about? So is this a genuine conflict, or can we find a way to make peace between these two seemingly opposing ideas? Well, that's what we're diving into today. We're going to break down the main arguments for externalism, see how they challenge the traditional view of self-knowledge, and finally, see if this conflict is real or if we can find some way to resolve it. Our guide for this deep dive is going to be the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on, surprise, surprise, externalism and self-knowledge. I'm sure as a philosopher you spent some time with it.
Let's do it. So first things first, for those of us who need a little refresher, can you lay out like the basic idea behind externalism?
Definitely. It's actually pretty simple at its core, even though the implications are huge. Externalism says that the meaning of our thoughts, the content of them, isn't just determined by what's going on inside our heads. The environment we're in, the external world, plays a crucial role in shaping that content. This is a big departure from that classic Cartesian view, where the mind is like the self-contained, isolated entity.
Right, like our minds aren't just these little boxes sealed off from the world.
Exactly. And what makes externalism really compelling is that it's not just some isolated idea. It actually fits in really well with a lot of the major theories about how concepts get their meaning, especially the ones being developed these days. Take, for instance, causal theories of content, the ones championed by philosophers like Dretske, Millikan, and Fodor. They say that a concept's meaning is fundamentally tied to its causal connections with the world. Then you have interpretationalist views, like the ones Davidson and Dennett developed, which say mental content is something we attribute to people based on how they behave in their environment. And let's not forget inferentialist accounts, like Sellers, which often say a concept's content is linked to the things in the environment that trigger or follow certain inferences. So you see, externalism isn't just the standalone theory, it's woven into the fabric of how we understand meaning in contemporary philosophy.
Okay, that sets the stage. But now, let's get to the fun part. This is where it gets really interesting, especially for us philosophers. The thought experiments. These are like the battlegrounds for externalism. I'm thinking specifically of the famous twin Earth scenario cooked up by Putnam. Could you walk us through that? Refresh our memories a bit.
You got it. Picture this. We have Earth, just as we know it. And then there's this other planet far, far away called, you guessed it, twin Earth. The catch, it looks exactly like Earth. Everything's the same. History, people, their behaviors, you name it. But, and here's the twist, the liquid they call water over there isn't H2O. It's this other compound, XYZ. Now, this XYZ stuff is a dead ringer for our water. It looks, tastes, and behaves just like it, but it's chemically different. Okay, so now we have Oscar, your average Joe here on Earth, and his doppelganger on twin Earth, twin Oscar. Neither one of them are chemists, so they can't tell the difference between real water and this XYZ stuff. The big idea here is that intuitively, when Oscar says water is wet, he's thinking about and talking about H2O, right? But twin Oscar, saying the exact same words, is actually thinking about and talking about XYZ twin water.
Whoa. So even though, like deep down, Oscar and twin Oscar feel the same way about water, Their mental states, their internal experience is identical. Because the stuff in their world is different, they're actually thinking about different things. Their minds are diverging, even though everything inside feels the same.
You got it. And if we go with the Freudian idea, which is pretty central in philosophy of language, that the meaning of a word determines what it refers to in the world, then since Oscar and twin Oscar are referring to different substances with the word water, their words must have different meanings too. And remember, they're duplicates, physically and psychologically, so this really throws a wrench into the idea that meaning comes purely from what's inside your head. The external environment is playing a crucial role here.
It's almost like our minds are reaching out, connecting with the specifics of the world around us, and that shapes what we're thinking. But hold on, this line of thinking doesn't just apply to natural kinds like water, does it? I mean, it goes beyond that.
Right, you are. Philosophers like McGinn, Stitch, and Burge, they've argued that this extends to concepts that are defined by social conventions, like sofa, for example. So when Oscar here on Earth thinks sofas are comfy, he's thinking about sofas as we define them in our society. But on Twin Earth, let's say they have this slightly broader definition of sofa. Maybe theirs include those super comfy armchairs, the ones we wouldn't usually call sofas here. So twin Oscar, thinking sofas are comfy, is including those armchairs in his thought. Again, we see a difference in reference, a difference in what the word picks out in the world just because of a slight difference in their social environment, even though Oscar and twin Oscar are identical internally. This points to a difference in the actual content of their thoughts about sofas, a difference caused by external factors.
Okay, I'm getting this picture of our minds not as these isolated boxes, but as these dynamic things shaped by the world around us in some pretty profound ways. You also mentioned some examples from the real world that show this idea in action outside of the thought experiments.
Oh, yeah. For instance, Ludlow pointed out this interesting thing about how chicory and endive have switched meanings in American and British English. To someone who's not a botanist, these leafy greens look almost the same, and they might even taste pretty similar. So you could have a British person and an American both thinking the same thing, chicory is delicious, but they're actually referring to different plants. The same word, because of the different linguistic environments they're in, is expressing a concept with a different content. And even thinking about water again, the actual composition of what we call water can vary a bit depending on where you are in the world because of the stuff mixed in with it, right? So even something as seemingly simple as water can have subtle variations in its reference and therefore its meaning depending on the environment.
Right, that's fascinating. So as you'd expect, such a fundamental challenge to how we traditionally think about the mind hasn't gone unanswered, right? There's been some pushback against externalism, yeah.
Oh, absolutely. There are lots of philosophers who, for very good reasons, disagree with these externalist conclusions. Some are looking for a middle ground, saying that, okay, maybe externalism holds for some aspects of meaning, but there's also this thing called narrow content that's determined purely by our internal states, regardless of the environment. Like, think about two-dimensional semantics, for example. It tries to make this distinction by saying that narrow content is like a function that maps different possible environments to the wide content that externalism describes. The idea is that maybe this narrow content is something we do have that special armchair access to. But overall, the debate about externalism is still very much alive and kicking.
Okay, so we've got externalism laid out the idea that the world plays a real active role in shaping what our thoughts are about. Now we're getting to the main event, the big philosophical showdown, the conflict between externalism and the idea of armchair self-knowledge. How does externalism, threaten our ability to just know what's going on in our own minds?
The problem is pretty straightforward. If externalism is true, if the content of our thoughts is at least partially determined by things in the environment, then it seems like knowing what we're thinking would require us to also have some knowledge about that environment.
Right. But knowing stuff about the external world, well, that's traditionally seen as an empirical thing, something we learn through observation and experience. And that goes against the idea that we can just figure out what we're thinking from the comfort of our armchairs purely through introspection.
Yeah, it's like if my thought about water depends on the existence of H2O out there in the world, then to know I'm thinking about water, I need to know that H2O is actually out there. And that's not something I can just figure out by thinking really hard. Right. That tension is what leads to the distinction between incompatibilism and compatibilism. Incompatibilists are like, nope, externalism and armchair self-knowledge just can't both be true. They clash. Compatibilists are like, hold on, maybe there's a way to make them work together. Interestingly, while most people initially thought this incompatibility was a bigger problem for externalism, some have argued that certain types of internalism might have their own issues explaining self-knowledge.
Okay, so how do incompatibilists argue their case? I know there's this thing called the reductio to armchair knowledge of the external world, which, as philosophers we know, is a pretty serious argument. Could you break that down for us?
Sure. Basically, the incompatibilist says, let's just assume, for the sake of argument, that both externalism and armchair self-knowledge are true. Now watch what happens. And what they try to show is that if you assume both are true, you end up with this absurd conclusion that you could know facts about the world, not just any facts, but contingent empirical facts, just by sitting in your armchair and thinking. You wouldn't need to go out and look at the world or do experiments. And for us philosophers, that's a big red flag. It suggests that at least one of those initial assumptions, either externalism or armchair self-knowledge, has to be wrong.
So they're saying that if both are true, then I could be like, I'm thinking about water, therefore water must exist. And I wouldn't need to do any science or anything to know this.
Exactly. A famous version of this argument comes from McKinsey. Let's say E stands for the specific environmental condition that externalism says is necessary for a thought to have a particular content. So for a thought about water, E would be the presence of actual H2O, as opposed to that XYZ stuff on Twin Earth. The incompatibilist argument goes like this. They say that if externalism, EXT, is true, and armchair self-knowledge, SK, is true, then someone like Oscar can know two things a priori, meaning just from armchair thinking. The first is, if Oscar's thinking that water is wet, then E obtains. And the second is, Oscar is thinking that water is wet.
So the first one connects my thought about water to the environmental condition that needs to be true for me to have that thought. And the second one is just me knowing what I'm thinking. And both of these, the incompatibilist says, should be knowable just from thinking, right?
Right. The idea is that if externalism is true, then the connection between a thought and its environmental condition is something we can grasp just by thinking about it without needing to go out and look. So that first proposition is a priori. And self-knowledge, by definition in this context, is also supposed to be armchair knowledge, a priori knowledge. But here's the problem. If Oscar knows both of those things a priori, then he can use a simple rule of logic, modus ponens, to deduce a third proposition. Therefore, E obtains. And this conclusion would also be a priori.
And remember, E is a fact about the world. It's saying something like water made of H2O exists in the environment. So they're saying I can know this fact just by thinking about water being wet.
Exactly. The absurdity is that E is the kind of thing that we normally think you can only know by going out and observing the world, by doing science. So the incompatibilist says, see, externalism and armchair self-knowledge lead to this crazy result, so they can't both be true. It's worth noting, though, as Byrne pointed out, that this argument mainly targets what we might call our peculiar access to our thoughts. It's not just that we know our thoughts better than others, which is called privileged access. It's that we supposedly have this special first-person way of knowing them that others don't. Even if this argument works, Oscar might still be better at knowing his own thoughts than anyone else, but the point is that he wouldn't have this unique armchair method for knowing their content.
Okay, so incompatibilists have presented a pretty strong challenge. Now, how have compatibilists, those who believe that externalism and self-knowledge can work together, responded to this? What are their strategies?
There have been some pretty clever responses. One way compatibilists push back, like Bruckner argued, is by saying, hold on, does externalism really commit us to the idea that the environmental conditions for our thoughts are knowable a priori? They say that thought experiments like Twin Earth definitely show that interacting with water is enough to have water thoughts, but they don't necessarily show that water needs to exist for us to have those thoughts, or that this supposed necessity is something we can figure out just by thinking.
So just because being around water gives me water thoughts doesn't mean water has to exist for me to have them, or that I could figure that out just by thinking.
Exactly. Now, the incompatibilist might come back and say, okay, but E isn't just about water existing. It could be something more like either water exists or a community using the water concept exists. The idea is that for externalism, if you have the water concept, then either you had to encounter real water or you got the concept from a group of people who did. And this more complex condition might seem knowable a priori if externalism is true.
Right, but even with this tweak, the compatibilists can still be like, wait a minute, are those the only ways to get the concept? Maybe someone could be in a completely waterless place, but still figure out, through pure thought and reasoning, what H2O is, and thus grasp the water concept. If we can't rule that out from the armchair, then the link between a water thought and the existence of water, or a water-using community, becomes much weaker.
And that's where things get really subtle. Philosophers have come up with scenarios like agnostic Oscar, where Oscar knows he's never encountered water and hasn't learned about it from anyone. Does that make the environmental condition knowable a priori for him? The debate gets really intricate here, getting into the very nature of our concepts and whether externalism really shows, just through thinking, that having a water thought requires a specific condition in the world.
This is getting deep.
Yeah.
What about this idea of externalism applied to empty concepts? I feel like that's a big one for philosophers.
Yeah, this one is really interesting. Philosophers like Stoneham and Sawyer have explored this. They've taken those twin Earth-style scenarios and applied them to concepts that don't refer to anything real. Imagine dry Earth, which is just like our Earth, except wherever we have water, they have super realistic holograms of water. The intuition is that dry Oscar, who uses the word water in this world, actually has an empty concept, because his water doesn't refer to any actual substance. But externalists might argue that even the content of this empty concept is determined by the lack of real water in his environment.
So even nothingness, like the absence of something, can play a role in shaping our concepts. That's a pretty mind-bending idea. But I'm sure there are objections to this too, right?
Oh, yeah. Bogosian and Segal, for instance, they've raised concerns that this could lead to some weird consequences. They've argued that it could make even the basic form or structure of our concepts dependent on the environment. Like, if our concept of water is this simple, non-descriptive thing, but dry Oscar's water concept is necessarily descriptive, maybe something like watery hologram, then the environmental difference seems to be changing the very structure of the concept. And that's a bit unsettling because the form of a concept is usually thought of as something internal, not determined by the world. There's a whole debate about whether the syntax or underlying structure of our thoughts can be shaped by the environment, and whether differences in form mean there are actually different underlying mental states.
And for us philosophers who love to ponder non-existent things, what about the argument that externalism about empty concepts has trouble distinguishing between concepts that are necessarily empty, like unicorn, and those that are only contingently empty, like water on dry earth?
Right. If an externalist says the unicorn concept is necessarily empty, meaning unicorns are literally impossible, it clashes with the fact that we can imagine them pretty clearly. On the other hand, if they say the unicorn concept is just contingently empty, with its meaning fixed by a description like horse with a horn, then it seems like externalism might not work in this case. The descriptive content would stay the same whether unicorns exist or not, suggesting it's the description, not the presence or absence of unicorns, that determines the meaning. So, yeah, externalism applied to empty concepts is a real philosophical rabbit hole.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, let's move on to another compatibilist strategy, this idea of transmission failure. It seems like something we philosophers who think about arguments and justification would really latch on to. What's the main idea here?
This one is fascinating. Philosophers like Davies and Wright came up with this. Basically, they're like, okay, let's say you're right that the two premises in the McKinsey-style argument, if Oscar is thinking that water is wet, then E obtains, and Oscar is thinking that water is wet, are knowable a priori. But is that enough? They say the problem with the incompatibilist argument is assuming that the justification we have for believing those premises automatically transfers to the conclusion, therefore E obtains, just because the logic of the argument is valid. We philosophers know that just because an argument is logically valid doesn't mean the conclusion is actually justified.
So even if I have good reasons to believe both premises, that doesn't automatically mean I have good reason to believe the conclusion in this case. I'm curious, why would justification fail to transfer here?
The idea is that the conclusion that water exists, or whatever E is already kind of baked in or presupposed when we say those premises are justified, especially the first one. Think of a classic circular argument. P is true because P is true. If you believe the premise, you already believe the conclusion. This is called warrant closure, where having justification for the premises automatically means you have justification for the conclusion. But the argument doesn't really give you any new justification for P if you didn't already believe it. The transmission failure folks say a similar thing is happening with the incompatibilist argument. For an externalist to accept those premises, they already have to assume that the environmental conditions, like the existence of water, are in place. Otherwise, how could you even have water thoughts?
It's like the argument is subtly relying on the very thing it's trying to prove, right? That seems like a pretty strong critique. But what are the arguments for why the conclusion would be presupposed by the premises?
One argument is that if you really think about the premise, Oscar is thinking that water is wet, and you're an externalist, then for Oscar to have that thought, the environment condition E, water existing, has to be true already. So believing that premise already assumes that E is true. There's also Wright's idea of default warrant, which says that we usually have a non-empirical kind of automatic justification for believing that common things like water exist, and this is part of what justifies our self-attributions.
Interesting. But as philosophers, we always got to dig deeper. What are some of the objections to this transmission failure idea?
Well, one criticism is that it's lumping together different kinds or strengths of justification. Just because the argument doesn't give the strongest possible justification for the conclusion doesn't mean it gives no justification. Maybe it gives a weaker kind of justification. And if any justification is transmitted, then the argument might still have some power. There's also a bigger worry, especially for those who are really attached to the idea of self-knowledge. By saying the conclusion is presupposed, the transmission failure, people might accidentally be giving up on the whole idea of armchair self-knowledge. If the justification for Oscar is thinking that water is wet, it ultimately comes from an assumption about the world, then it's not really armchair knowledge after all.
Okay, I see the problem. How have they answered these objections?
Some have admitted that it might be hard to say that Oscar is thinking that water is wet is truly, purely knowable a priori. But they say we can still salvage some kind of privileged self-knowledge, maybe something like, if E obtains, then I am thinking that water is wet, which could still be a priori. Others, like Wright, insist that we shouldn't assume that justification for water exists has to be empirical. Maybe there's some fundamental, non-empirical default entitlement to believe in basic things about the world we perceive, and this underpins our self-knowledge. But even this default warrant idea has its critics. Some philosophers say it's too weak to counter the argument, or that it blurs the line between genuine justification and just assuming things without question.
So it sounds like the debate about transmission failure gets pretty deep, touching on the very nature of justification, what we presuppose when we make claims, and how much our knowledge of our own minds is tied up with our beliefs about the world.
Definitely. It really shows how complicated it can get when you try to reconcile two seemingly opposite philosophical ideas.
Okay, let's switch gears a bit. Another way compatibilists have dealt with this apparent conflict is by saying, hey, maybe the problem isn't externalism. Maybe it's our idea of self-knowledge that needs a makeover. What's the argument for giving up on that strong, armchair-based view of self-knowledge, especially given the challenges of externalism?
This is where things get a little more radical. This response acknowledges the force of the incompatibilist arguments and suggests that maybe we've been expecting too much from self-knowledge all along. Some philosophers, even some who came up with versions of the reductio argument, like McKinsey, have taken it to mean that strong armchair self-knowledge is just plain wrong. They argue that the Cartesian picture of perfect, immediate, introspective access to our own thoughts has already been challenged, both by philosophers and by empirical research.
Yeah, there's definitely a growing feeling that maybe we don't have that completely clear, error-free window into our minds that Descartes thought we did.
Right. And a lot of support for this comes from psychology, which is finding more and more evidence that our self-knowledge is much more limited, fallible, and indirect than we tend to think. There are tons of studies showing that we often don't know the real reasons for our choices, and we often make up reasons after the fact to explain our behavior and mental states.
So they're saying if psychology is already casting doubt on self-knowledge, then we shouldn't be too worried if externalism seems to weaken it further.
Exactly. Some philosophers, drawing on Quine, who challenge the whole idea of analytic versus synthetic truths, argue that all knowledge, even self-knowledge, ultimately comes from experience, even if it's indirect. Ryle, in his critique of The Ghost in the Machine, famously argued that self-knowledge isn't introspection at all, but is more like how we understand other people's minds by observing their behavior. While not everyone buys into Ryle's behaviorism, it does fit with the idea that self-knowledge isn't this direct internal thing. More recently, cognitive scientists like Carruthers have argued that when we attribute thoughts to ourselves, we're actually interpreting our own sensory input, which makes the line between first-person and third-person knowledge much blurrier.
And there's that other idea too, right? The one externalists have about how you need to actually interact with the world to have certain concepts in the first place.
Absolutely. Brewer, for example, argued that to have a concept for something, you need to be able to pick out examples of it in the world through perception. So if that's true for water, then even having the concept means you've had some empirical encounter with water. This means that when we say Oscar is thinking that water is wet, Even just having the concept of water might already involve knowledge about the world, knowledge that isn't purely a priori. The debate here is about whether there's a clear difference between learning a concept through experience and then, after you've learned it, having a priori self-knowledge about thoughts involving that concept.
And lastly, we talk about that idea of a transcendental argument. How does that try to bring externalism and self-knowledge together?
This one's a little less common. Basically, instead of denying that externalism and self-knowledge could lead to armchair knowledge of the world, which is what the reductio argument tries to do, the transcendental argument kind of embraces it. It says, yeah, maybe that's true, but instead of being absurd, it's actually a defense against skepticism. The idea is that our ability to know our own thoughts, which are about the world, somehow guarantees that the world exists and is basically like we think it is. Putnam is probably the most famous philosopher who's made arguments along these lines, but it's not clear how many externalists actually buy into this approach or if they think the reductio argument really works as an anti-skeptical argument. Plus, these transcendental arguments are often really complicated and still up for debate. Sawyer, for instance, while agreeing that a non-empirical kind of justification might transfer to a belief about the world, thinks that this justification is probably too weak to actually defeat skepticism.
So we've seen all sorts of responses to the reductio argument, everything from challenging its premises to completely rethinking what self-knowledge is. It really highlights the complexity of this whole issue.
It definitely shows how deep this philosophical rabbit hole goes.
Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about the other big challenge that incompatibilists have brought up, the slow-switching thought experiments. These are weird and fascinating. Can you explain what those are all about?
You bet. The slow switch argument is different from the reductio argument. Instead of trying to show a logical contradiction, these thought experiments try to show that externalism leads to a situation where we can't really tell what our thoughts are about from the armchair, at least not in the way that philosophers have traditionally thought.
So they're not trying to show that externalism and self-knowledge lead to something impossible, but rather that, in some situations, externalism makes it really hard to actually know what we're thinking.
Exactly. The classic example is this. Imagine Oscar, our guy, slowly being moved from Earth to Twin Earth without him knowing. This is the slow switch. As he spends more time on Twin Earth interacting with that XYZ stuff, the meaning of his water concept slowly changes. It goes from referring to H2O to referring to XYZ, and all of this happens without him noticing.
So at first when he thinks or says water, he means the water we have here. But as he gets used to the twin water, his thought and his use of the word starts to refer to that instead. And the key is that he's completely unaware of this change.
That's the heart of the thought experiment. And because this shift in meaning happens gradually and without him realizing it, the argument is that Oscar can't figure out, just by thinking about it, whether his thoughts about water are actually about water or twin water. If a water thought is just a thought he'd express using the word water, then the slow switch scenario seems to mean that he can't know, through introspection alone, whether he's having a real water thought or a twin water thought.
And that inability to tell the difference between those two thoughts, just by looking inward, seems to go against the whole idea of armchair self-knowledge. If I can't tell whether I'm thinking about water or twin water, how can I really know what I'm thinking?
That's the challenge. Burge, the philosopher who came up with this thought experiment, argues that this shows armchair self-knowledge is just plain false in cases like this, assuming externalism is true. Bokoshian, while agreeing with Burge, took this a step further with what he called the memory argument, which really focuses on the problem.
The memory argument. This sounds like a juicy one. Could you break down the main points of it?
Okay, here's how it goes. Boghossian says, if Oscar doesn't forget anything between 2 points in time, T1 and T2, then anything he knows at T1, he still knows at T2. This makes sense, right? If you remember something, you still know it. Then he says, B, in the slow switch scenario, we're assuming Oscar doesn't forget anything. That's just part of the setup. Then the crucial part. C, at time T2, after the switch, Oscar doesn't know he's thinking the same thought P that he was thinking at T1. Because his water concept now refers to twin water, he doesn't realize he's no longer thinking the same thought about water that he was before. And from all this, he concludes, D, that Oscar didn't actually know at T1 that he was thinking P in the first place.
So even if he knew what he was thinking before the switch, the gradual change in his water concept because of the new environment messes that knowledge up.
That's the idea. The first premise about memory is pretty uncontroversial. The second is just part of the thought experiment. The third premise is the key, saying that after the switch, he's no longer thinking the same thought. And this leads to the conclusion that his initial claim of knowing his own thought was wrong.
Okay, so we've got the slow switch and memory arguments laid out. Those are some pretty tough challenges to self-knowledge. How have compatibilists tried to deal with them? How can they hold on to self-knowledge even with externalism in these weird scenarios?
Compatibilists have a few tricks up their sleeves. One response, and this one comes from Burge himself, is to point out the existence of what are called self-verifying judgments. These are judgments about our own thoughts that are true simply because we make them. A good example is, I am thinking right now that water is wet. Burge argues that in the very act of thinking and judging that, you are necessarily having the thought the judgment is about.
So even if Oscar usually can't tell the difference between a water thought and a twin water thought after the switch, in this specific case where he's making a judgment about his current thought, he seems to have a pretty solid grasp of what he's thinking.
Exactly. These self-verifying judgments are special because they're about our current thoughts and they work in a self-referential way. But Burge argues that they're enough to show that Oscar doesn't completely lack armchair self-knowledge. It's a limited kind of self-knowledge, but it's still significant.
Another response that seems pretty intuitive is to say that these slow switch scenarios are so outlandish and unlikely that they don't really tell us anything about our actual everyday self-knowledge. What do you think about that one?
That's the relevant alternatives approach, and it's a big deal in epistemology. It says we don't have to rule out every single possible way we could be wrong to say we know something. We only need to rule out the possibilities that are actually relevant, the ones that could plausibly be true. In most normal situations, the idea of not